Hi, everybody joining us. Just the time actually was amazing and got away from us. So we are just setting up the Facebook Live. And we'll give you the link to that. For just the panelists and maybe some others, you should know that we are now live on Facebook, I believe. We'll see here. All right, you can talk about amongst yourselves. I'm checking to see if this is happening. I'm not sure. Always a mystery.
Shay, can I ask, can people come on right now? Because someone's texting me saying they can't get on.
So yeah, people, if they tried to get in about 3 minutes ago, it wouldn't have worked, so they can try again. And it should work well. So Linda's one of the planners, and so I'm that's why she's popping in. So she'll have her video off. And we are live now. So Susan, you are welcome to sort of give us a hello and go ahead and start.
Okay. My name is Susan Boyd, and I'm going to be moderating the event today. I'm quite excited. I can't wait to hear from our three panelists and to take your questions after they speak. For some of you who might not know me, I'm a professor at the University of Victoria, but I live in Vancouver, BC. I've long worked in harm reduction, and I collaborate with drug user unions, specifically in the last 10 years, more so with Vandu and SNAP and the Women's Group. My work has focused on the harms of drug prohibition and resistance against drug prohibition, trying to tell that story and make it vocal in relation to local resistance to our drug war policies. But the area that I focused on from the time I was a harm reduction outreach worker in the early 1990s till today is around women's issues, especially mothers and parents who've given birth, and the social service, child protection, health, and legal surveillance on these people, on these parents, and that the brunt of our drug policy falls on them in ways that might be more visible to other people. And one of those ways is through child apprehension by the state. And for these families, their suffering is lifelong often. And so our panelists will be speaking to issues around this today as well. At this point, I'd like to mention that Sophie is here to do translation and interpretation, and she can speak to that.
Thank you, Susan. I'll start in French and then repeat in English. Alors, bonjour tout le monde, bienvenue. Si c'est la première fois que vous vous joignez à un Stimulus Connect, on offre l'interprétation simultanée à l'écrit. Alors, pour y accéder, vous pouvez cliquer sur CC, sous-titres, en bas de votre écran. On vous recommande d'activer les sous-titres et aussi d'ouvrir la fenêtre de transcription pour voir la transcription complète. En suivant les deux, ça va être plus facile de suivre ce qui se dit. Si jamais vous êtes sur une tablette, un téléphone, l'orientation de votre outil pourrait affecter ce que vous voyez. Alors, c'est peut-être optimal de le mettre à l'horizontale, comme ça, vous allez pouvoir voir tous les sous-titres et vous pouvez activer les sous-titres dans vos paramètres. Et finalement, si vous avez des questions, vous pouvez les poser en français et ça va nous faire plaisir de les traduire et de s'assurer que tout le monde comprenne. Alors, bonne rencontre. Just to repeat in English, I'm offering simultaneous interpretation in written form. To access the simultaneous interpretation, you can click on CC or subtitles at the bottom of your screen. If you're on a computer, we recommend that you activate the subtitles and that you open the full transcription as well. If you're on a mobile device, you can activate your subtitles in your Zoom parameters, and the orientation of your device can affect what you see. And questions are welcome in English and French. So have a great meeting. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Sophie. I'd also like to say that we're not able to meet face-to-face. So for some of you, including myself, you might find the sort of working online like this difficult and managing, the chat. But let's just keep in mind that we'll just remain patient and we'll work today with patience and humor. When things don't go well with the technology, we'll figure it out. We want to create a safe space for the panelists and the participants. So I'd encourage everyone to introduce themselves through the chat. We have people registered for this event from many, many places. We're using the hashtag StimulusConnect. Shay can help us with any technical issues that we might have, and she's monitoring through the whole session the chat and the question and answer. So this event's going to be recorded as well, and it'll be available next week on the Stimulus website. If you want to share it with friends who aren't able to come today and participate. Anyway, you should check out the website. It has a list of resources as well that are pertinent to the issues that we're going to be discussing today.
Susan, can I interrupt you?
Yeah.
I just want to do a bit of a land recognition. And
oh, yeah.
Well, and part of it is like, if we get too far into it, we won't be doing it at the beginning of the meeting. And so on behalf of all of us on the panel and Susan, the moderator, Natalie and I who are wrangling the chat, I want to recognize that all of us are living and working and playing and managing multiple epidemics on this land, that we are working from coast to coast to coast, and that this land is indeed stolen land. The land, the footsteps of the First Nations, Métis and Inuit people have been on this land forever, and we are settlers and we were welcomed here, but the oppression has been clear. I want to honor that as we move forward today, that First Nations, Métis and Inuit people are continuing to live through historic and current systemic racism, that we have lands that are both treaty, non-treaty, unceded, all of these lands, including the lands where we own or rent space that we didn't purchase from the correct people. All of this is to say we're all treaty people, and please take a moment to think about where you are and your connection to the land, and your connection to the First Peoples. And I'll hand it back to you, Susan.
Thank you so much, Shay. I want to say, Shay, too, that some people are still having trouble getting on right now, so I don't know what that's about, but thought I'd bring it to your attention.
What I'm going to do is I'm going to put in the chat for everybody the link to this room at this time. If you can copy and paste it out of there, great. If not, you can actually go to you might be able to go to the top left-hand corner and pull the link yourself, or use the link you use to get in and just share it with them. This happens, and I'll continue to work on getting people in as we go. Sorry for the inconvenience, everybody.
Yeah, it's fine. Okay. All right. Anyway, there'll be questions that will be in the question and answer, and I'll be monitoring that, as I mentioned. And we welcome questions in whatever language that you prefer. And we have registrants from rural, frontier, isolated communities as far as Quebec, Fort St. John's, BC, Kenora, Ontario, Turner Valley, Alberta, Windsor, Nova Scotia, and we actually have a few guests from the United States. But most importantly, we would really like to thank all the people who have used drugs, who have expertise in drug use, and have been involved in the planning today, and to our panelists. The stimulus program is based on the Canadian Drug Policy Coalition, and it functions in collaboration, partnership with CAPUD and AIDQ. I want to thanks to all the people, many, who were involved in the planning of these sessions, especially today's session. Okay. We've had the, Shay reminded us, colonization and the land recognition. But I also want to speak for a moment before we introduce the panelists in relation to an acknowledgement of how ongoing colonialism intersects with drug prohibition, or the war on drugs, whatever term you prefer to use. The criminalization of people who use currently illegal drugs, and the demonization and punishment of them, as well as mothers and parents who have children. But I want to be clear that our drug policies in relation to parents as well is unequal, and that it's Indigenous, Black, and poor families that are most targeted by social work, health, and law enforcement. And that has had a devastating impact and continues to today. But I also want to, before we begin, usually at the end of a meeting, especially in the drug user unions, we'll take a moment of silence at the end to honor people who have passed away due to the drug war and other health-related issues. But today we thought we would do it before the panelists speak. And we'd like to have a moment of silence for all those people we have lost through death, through child apprehension, due to the many drug war policies that we've had. And to also acknowledge the two epidemics and the increasing harm that stems from them. And with the illegal drug overdose crisis, these are preventable deaths. And so the burden of suffering has really increased tremendously. So if we could have a moment of silence right now for all our loved one, all our friends and family who we've lost through our drug war policy, through the war on drugs. And take a minute. Okay, thank you, everyone. So some background before our panelists is that there are, as I mentioned, overlapping oppressions that can challenge parents and caregivers who use substances. And this may be intersecting factors such as sexism, racism, colonialism, class bias, transphobia, homophobia. So we're going to discuss today what are some harm reduction strategies for parents or caregivers who use substances. What are the implications of professionals making assumptions about parents and other caregivers who use substances? What is the real duty to report? How can service providers address barriers faced by caregivers accessing services? And how should we manage or reform or abolish children's services? What do we do when there is no best practice? So I'm going to hand this over to our presenters. They're going to speak for roughly 10 minutes each, and then we'll have questions at the end, and there'll be plenty of time for questions, so not to worry. And you might see that, you know, the second panelist or the third answers the question that you had earlier on. So our panelists will start with Vida. She's from the Manitoba Harm Reduction Network. And then Kayla will be speaking, and she's from Prairie Harm Reduction in Saskatoon. And then our last presenter is Cassandra. She's a harm reduction specialist for an AIDS service organization in Toronto. So let's welcome them. And our first speaker, Vida.
Thank you. Hi there. As Susan mentioned, my name is Vida, and I'm the project coordinator at the Manitoba Harm Reduction Network. My role there is that I support and collaborate with advisory councils of people who use drugs and are impacted by systemic violence. And those groups direct the work of our organization. I'm speaking to you today from Treaty 1, from my home, which is on Indigenous land. My spot in particular has been stewarded by 7 different groups of Anishinaabe people and is near a place called Catfish Creek. Our relationship to the land is really important in harm reduction work because the only reason we have to talk about harm reduction and drug-related harms is because of colonizations and systemic harms. I don't know about everyone's particular ancestors, but my grandparents, when they immigrated, definitely brought with them problematic substance use. I know why my supervisor put forward my name to speak today too, and that's because I've been really vocal about the benefits of drug use for me in recovering from postpartum in my parenting journey. That's been really difficult for me, and I found so many benefits in returning to some of the substance use that I had before. And while I want to acknowledge my own drug use, I used illegal drugs yesterday. It's really important to also say that my experiences with drug use are really colored by all the privileges that I have in my life, including being white and middle class. I'm not at much risk of experiencing systemic harms. And in harm reduction, we always need to focus on the systemic harms and the folks who are most likely to experience them. And that's why we made this social media campaign that I've been asked to share today for Substance Awareness Week last week. And I'm going to share my screen, so give me one sec. Okay. Can you guys see my screen? Yeah, okay. Oh, no.
Maybe under view. There you are.
Good? Better? Okay.
we're good.
So the background of this social media campaign is that we had a gathering of parents that use drugs, and also other folks, helpers, Indigenous birth workers, elders and knowledge keepers, and community helpers. And we all did a day together of learning and ceremony. And at the end of the day, we asked folks what they most wanted us to communicate to the public in our role as an advocacy organization. And then we made a campaign based on those responses. So I'm gonna do a bit of a Cole's Notes version. If you want to see the whole posts with the stats and the research that we use to back up each claim, those are available on our Facebook, which is the Manitoba Harm Reduction Network. I'm trying to highlight today some of the tangible shifts folks can make in their practices to better support people who use drugs. So our first post was about overdose, and we shared about how parental overdose impacts children, and how the overdose of a child can impact parents. You know, there's a lot of research to back up how big and traumatic those effects are, the lasting grief. We know that overdose rates are too high and have unfortunately been raised even more with COVID. You know, in our moment right before we started, it was a little bit hard to speak right after because the losses right now have just been so exorbitant in our province. And overdose needs to be thought about and addressed in the context of families and how to support members of those families in using drugs if they're going to without risk of overdose. Things like safe supply of preferred substances, which for anyone that doesn't know means giving people the drugs they need that are safe and checked and free of contamination, can help our family members stay alive and reduce further instances of trauma. Getting folks safe supply or substitution therapies is a helpful intervention for parents that use drugs. Our second post focused on the fact that 80 to 90% of substance use isn't problematic, and that using drugs does not preclude someone from being a good parent. While this hopefully is common sense to the folks on this call, it's still unfortunately kind of a contentious topic. And we know that this stigma about drug use primarily impacts Black and Indigenous kids. In Manitoba, 89% of the youth in care are Indigenous, even though they make up only 25% of the youth population. There are no circumstances where drug use should be the reason for apprehending children. Just like, no, none at all. If the reason is poverty and there's bare cupboards, then parents should be given the resources to improve that. And although I suspect I'm in good company in this call and folks are hopefully generally opposed to child apprehension, if there's any holdouts attending this workshop, I want to challenge you a bit. If you don't think that my kids should be apprehended because I used illegal drugs yesterday, but have ever thought that someone else's kids should be apprehended because they used drugs, I want you to interrogate why that is. Because a lot of the ways those decisions are made are based on classism and racism. Shifting the way that workers think about drug use to not assuming drug use is a problem, unless the parents are framing it that way, is a way to support parents that use drugs. Our third post was about service access. We looked at a study by Nancy Poole that showed that most women who use drugs don't feel safe accessing services. Folks cited shame, fear of losing children, and prejudicial treatment as the top reasons for not feeling safe. If we want parents who use drugs to access help, we need to remove those barriers from services and remove policies that reinforce those barriers, which includes duty to report. For workers who fear they might get in trouble for not reporting, I'd ask you to consider what the repercussions are. As a worker, if I don't report, I mean, not for my organization, but if I worked for somewhere else, maybe I'd face, a repercussion like a slap on the wrist or a reprimand for not reporting, versus the repercussions of the trauma of reporting and tearing families apart. Those repercussions are different. So interrogating, challenging, and deleting duty to report policies and practices is a way to support parents who use drugs. Our fourth post was the one we knew would make people mad, especially a bunch of white wine moms. We focused on the idea of hierarchies of drugs and the belief that some substances are okay and others aren't as problematic. The belief that wine is okay and crack is not is rooted in white supremacy and classism. Same with what Carl Hart has called psychedelic exceptionalism, which is a big thing in my community because we all love psychedelics, where people of privilege will separate their own drug use of using psychedelics from more stigmatized drugs and advocate for the benefits of psychedelics without acknowledging the benefits of other or stigmatized drugs. Any substance can be beneficial or harmful depending on the context and the systemic harms associated. And I really mean any substance. So I'm saying that crack cocaine can be helpful and beneficial to people or not, depending on their context. Same with methamphetamines, same with psychedelics, cannabis, wine, all of it. It can be beneficial or not, depending on context and systemic harms. There's actually a lot more harm reduction tools available for some more commonly used substances like alcohol. You know, people know about pumping and dumping, or you can even get breast milk test strips to see if your milk is safe to feed baby after you were drinking. But it's really hard to find this information about other drugs. I know I looked for it for some psychedelics and couldn't find it. So we really need more readily available information and harm reduction information available about all drugs. And the common idea just not to use it because we don't have the information isn't necessarily helpful to everyone. To support parents to use drugs, we need to stop the racist and classist practice of stigmatizing some drugs while elevating others. And the last post we wrapped up with last week was the message that we tie to all things, which is that we all love someone who uses drugs. And as a practical guideline, I'd want all people working with people who use drugs to hold this sentiment close to your heart. And that was our social media thing last week. Let me just go back over here and stop sharing my screen.
Vita, I did that for you, so you are fine. Sorry about that.
No worries. And just as a last thought, I was reminded of something this morning on Instagram. Fred Hampton was a 21-year-old Black activist who was murdered by the FBI on this day in 1969. And he said some words which I felt like could apply to this conversation as well, which is, he said, "Theory's cool, but theory without practice ain't shit." And that's where I'd like to end. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Vita. I'm sure people have questions. We hear from the other panelists, so we're going to move on to Kayla.
Good afternoon, everybody. At least it's afternoon where I am. I'm coming today to be with you from Treaty 6 territory in the homeland of the Métis, sitting in my home in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan. I am the Associate Director for Prairie Harm Reduction. We are the primary harm reduction agency that supports people who are living with, affected by, and at risk of HIV and hepatitis C, and all the systemic barriers that are associated with people most affected by HIV in our province, which are intravenous drug users and people who use substances. I oversee a program at our agency called Family Support, and Family Support has been operating for almost 10 years now, working with families who are considered high risk of apprehension or have ministry involvement. And they have this involvement due to a variety of things, and a lot of things that Vita already brought up when she was speaking around barriers that people face because of colonialism and broken systems that oppress people who are already at less of an advantage than someone like myself, who is a white settler on this land. We work with families in a different way than a lot of other supports do, which is, I guess, why I'm here today. Last year, we had there was about 970 families that accessed support from us. All of those families facing the threat of child apprehension or already had their children taken from them and are, trying to get their children returned back from care while trying to overcome poverty and discrimination due to substance use and mental health concerns and, housing instability, intimate partner violence, all of those reasons why child protection steps in and feels like they have the right to take the children. We provide a variety of support. We're what I call generalists. So we have to be good at a lot of things in order to support families so that the children can safely remain with their parents. And what that looks like for our families is access to transportation. We have a van, we have car seats, we drive people, we do in-home supports, informal counseling that we call emotional support, lots of referrals, lots of resources. We do a lot of things around housing, attending, case conferences, family court, sitting through doctor's appointments with families if need be, really anything that addresses the barriers that have been identified by the system. We have always worked from a harm reduction lens, and our program is a little bit different from other programs because our program was actually designed by the Ministry of Social Services in Saskatchewan. And before you think that's really cool and amazing that our ministry would do that, we're one of 5 contracts that exists in the province under this same mandate. And we're the only one that operates in the way that we do and supports families in the way that we do. And the reason for that is when the ministry designed this program, they approached the agency to house the program because of its reputation for engaging people in community. And being placed at a harm reduction agency, and the only one program placed at a harm reduction agency, we then embedded harm reduction approaches into how we work with families, which is why we're successful. There's, for many of you, you understand in, harm reduction, there is no magic way. Really what harm reduction is and harm reduction practice shows us is that our job is really not to be assholes. And we're really there to support people wherever they are, however they want, with whatever they need. And it's our jobs as professionals and support workers to be there for them, without judgment, without criticism, without making them jump through a bunch of hoops in order to access services. And that's one of the biggest things with our program is that there is no requirements. Do you have children? Yes or no? That's really it. And if you don't have your children, can we help you get them back? You don't have to be abstinent. You don't have to be working on your addictions. You don't have to be attending certain appointments. There is no such thing as overuse of services or manipulation of services. We don't ban people from services if they're mean to us. It's really about being as available and open to supporting the families that we support as possible, however they want. It's all voluntary, and they can access supports as little or as much as they want. So some of our families we see every couple of weeks, or we hear from them every few months when something happens and they feel they need help. Some of our families we talk to dozens of times a day because that's where their need is at the time. And we, will do so with every one of them. Our services are available 365 days a year until midnight. And that's another big thing with how we're able to fill so many gaps and work with the number of people that we do, is that we really are available all the time. Families come to us in a variety of ways. A good portion of them self-refer because they know about us from community, from their sister accessed us, or their aunt, or their cousin or a friend of theirs, and tells them to call us if they need help. We do get referrals from child protection workers, and we do get referrals from community agencies, lots of medical professionals, doctors, the hospital, who identify families who could be at risk of their children being apprehended and hope that community support can intervene before that happens. We work in the child protection realm, like we really do. We're there to prevent children from going into care more so than anything. And so a lot of the work that we do with families, instead of, if they're using substances, instead of saying you're using substances, you can't parent, then we talk to them about, well, how can we use substances and how can you parent in a way that the children can be in your care and the ministry will leave you alone, right? And it's about looking at what is happening. For so many of the families that are referred, to our program and who, self-refer to our program, the answers are very simple. Like, we get lots of referrals for medical neglect. Well, then we drive them to their appointments and they get there. Like, it's not a complex fix. For a lot of things, it's very basic. You don't have food? Well, let's take you to get food. Let's find you food. You don't have housing? Let's find you housing. And the problem with so many of our systems is that they're not set up to they're set up to respond to crisis in a very aggressive way, but not set up to actually look at what the problems are and find the simple solutions for them. There's not always simple solutions, but 90% of the work we do is driving people places and helping connect them to other services so they can have their basic needs met. One of the things that I was asked to talk about today, or suggested to talk about, was duty to report. We operate in a very different way because we are funded by the Ministry of Social Services. We are bound by the same confidentiality agreement that those workers are. So we do have access to their child protection files in a way that other services do not. And so we can phone and find out what is happening with their file, what the workers have done, what the history is, and all of those things without a lot of other barriers that other organizations face. But duty to report, and what we find with duty to report, is lots of people come in contact with the Ministry of Social Services here because a community agency or support or doctor or someone has called them in. And they're called in often for all of these simple things that could be fixed if they just had access to services, right? Or access to support in a way that they feel safe. And what I find so often is that workers phone people in and community agencies phone people in because they want to make sure that they've checked all the boxes and that they can go home at the end of the day saying, well, I did all that I could. Or, it's the fear of, not doing enough. And a big piece of it is that most places do not have the resources to refer people to. And so I don't know about other provinces here, but here we see a lot of services focused around pregnancy and, the first 6 months of a child's life. And then things seem to taper off very quickly after that. And there isn't those opportunistic supports available to help people in a way that they feel safe. The services that we offer and the way that we offer things, it's not provincial wide. This is very much a Saskatoon thing. It doesn't exist anywhere else. If I try and deal with child protection in other cities in our province, I have a horrible time getting them to work cooperatively with us. I have a horrible time trying to access information and a horrible time trying to advocate. Not that advocating within the city is always super simple, but at least I have some better avenues here to do so. We have, out of the families that we work with, about 70% of them have open protection files when we come into contact with them. So that's a huge number of people. And probably 20 to 30% of those do not have their children in their care. That's a huge number of children in care, and disproportionately Indigenous families where I live. And so, like Vita was saying, the impact on people of color is far greater than our Caucasian families that we come in contact with. And the implications for our lower income families versus families who are of higher income that get directed to us through child protection. Our families who are lower income have a far harder time navigating those services and getting their children back out of care than our families who are of a higher socioeconomic status. There's lots of things that we do. Like I said, there's a no ban, we're a no ban agency, sorry. And so we see a lot of people coming to us because they're not welcome anywhere else. They aren't welcome in shelters. They're not welcome on public transit. They're not welcome at other community agencies because they've been too difficult to deal with. And what we find so often is that nobody stops to look at why they're deemed too difficult to work with. I'm a strong believer that if someone's too difficult to work with, the problem is your program, not the person. And if you stop to listen to why they're upset or what is going on, then you recognize the trauma that they're feeling. And for families and women in specifically, the fear of having your children taken is so immense and so huge that that fear prevents people from accessing services, and it prevents them from reaching out for help when they need it, and it prevents them from, you know, accessing healthcare and, you know, different and coming into contact with different people because they're so frightened that their children are going to be taken. And that's generations of trauma that they're carrying with them. So when they come and the ministry is showing up at their door, I'd be upset too. And if they don't want to be nice to me that day, that's okay. I can take that. But I'm not going to restrict them from services because of that. I can talk a long time about what we do because it's so broad in spectrum, but I'm going to leave it at that and then answer any questions that come up after. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kayla. And now we're going to move over to Cassandra, who provides some insights on these issues too.
Hi, good afternoon from where I am. My name is Cassandra. I'm from Toronto, of Jamaican descent. I'm currently working for an aid service organization as a harm reduction specialist, began as their harm reduction coordinator in 2018. But I didn't come here to talk to you about the work that I do on a day-to-day basis as it relates to my role. I would like to talk to you about my experience as a mother who's had their children apprehended. There was a day that I didn't have the ability to even talk about my children around people or even hear my children's names around people. And I think that came from guilt that resonated within me and just remembering the downward spiral that began the day that I had to pack my son's bags and bring them to a child protection office in Toronto. And I think I was allowed to accompany them as far as the parking lot. I gave them kisses and the worker said, "You have to leave now." And my subway ride home was, I believe, the day that changed my life. That day I decided that I might not want to be here anymore. I didn't understand what life would be like going home to an empty house where my children weren't there. I understood that my family called CIS on me because they smell weed in the house and didn't know if it was me or my husband smoking. But 2 weeks before my children were apprehended, my husband was deported. So I was alone, left to go home alone to my large 2-bedroom housing apartment where I would sit down and call my son's names and cook large meals in the kitchen, forgetting that they weren't there, setting out their toys, cleaning up their books, and I didn't know how to live life without them. I remember the day that I lost my housing, I actually just walked away. I had a suitcase, I had a backpack, and I navigated through the transit system, you know, and if those of you know about the Blue Night bus, the Blue Night runs all night. So, and that's a pretty exciting bus. So I would just preoccupy myself with the different people on the bus, and no one knew that I wasn't going anywhere. You know, I blended in really well, but I wandered. And I did this for years. And, you know, some people would ask, where was your family? I have a huge family. I actually got arrested with my family. I was arrested in a raid with my family. And I wasn't the target, but I was arrested as head of the criminal organization and placed on a $50,000 bail. And I remember my worker telling me, "You're lucky we already have your kids because you would have lost them today." So I would visit them. You know, I had therapeutic access visits where I had to prepare meals and have diapers and formula ready and be there all day, but couldn't work because I had to be available for my visits. And attendance was important. So I said, okay, well, do I have to hustle or do I have to find a way to get food or take care of them? And it was really just a matter of me not knowing how to do things, but I did it. I went to the anger management classes. I went to the parenting classes. I did everything the workers asked. And the morning of March 18th, 2009, I lost all access to my sons. And I remember standing in the family court office, courtroom, and saying, "I'm not signing anything, I want to leave." And I remember someone looking at me and saying, "It doesn't matter if you sign anything, the decision's already been made." So I said, "Why am I here?" And I left. I feel like my fight was in vain. I didn't think that when I opened the door to that worker the first day that they came into my life, that I didn't have a fighting chance of getting any of my children back. I had no idea. I thought, you know what, if I did what they said, if I was open to taking the tests, I disclosed my marijuana use. I said, I smoke weed. But my tests were actually part of the mother risk program, and other drugs came up, drugs I knew I never took. So I felt that there was something that was a sign that maybe I wasn't meant to be a mother. Maybe I wasn't meant to have children. I wasn't meant to have a family, the family I wanted so much, because as a little girl growing up being beaten and bullied, I just very much looked forward to being an adult and just restarting my life. But this wasn't the restart that I expected, and there was a time that I remember, even in the day, past the day that I had to bring my sons to the office, I remember not wanting to live. And I remember there not being, a worker or anyone that followed up with me to say, hey, Miss Smith, are you okay? What's going on? Any updates? Did you get housing? Nothing. It was like they just took my sons and disappeared. But I remember working at an employment center, and I was a receptionist, and I opened the door and there was a newspaper, and a little boy was singing in church with a little car in his hand as a microphone, and that was my son. And I couldn't get through the rest of my day at work. And it was a placement through the city's program if you're on social services. So, I didn't have very many friends in the office. I was new. They knew I was on welfare, so they treated me differently. And I had to hide that day that I'd seen my son for the first time in years on the cover of a newspaper, and I couldn't do anything. I couldn't have any emotion. And I felt that my emotions were stifled for a really long time, and just feeling and swimming in that ocean of guilt. I found different substances that my friends had, that one called mood stabilizers that I used, and I remember not crying. I remember sitting and thinking about them, and the mood stabilizers stopped me from crying. And I said, this is amazing. This is what I need. And I ran to that every day. I needed it every day because I got tired of crying and seeing little Black boys on the first day of school and on the bus that looked like my sons. And I wanted to hug them and I wanted to kiss them, and I would just cry. I didn't know how to feel because I didn't know what to do. But I remember crying and not feeling like I was a person. But my dad said something to me that really resonated. And he said in a phone call, Cassandra, in order for your life to change, you have to let go of the guilt you're holding on to. Knowing that things that just happened just weren't, the ball wasn't in your court. But in order for your sons to know who you are, to be told your story by you have to survive this. And I got a phone call on May 13th, 2013, that my dad overdosed in Thunder Bay. And I was on the streetcar, and I remember just screaming on the streetcar and just screaming his name, remembering what he told me, remembering that this is a life that I have to continue living without him, without his words. And maybe he intended on saying these words to me before he went, but that was another day that my life changed. That was another day that I knew I would have to continue this journey without someone, the one person that I felt, even as far away as he was, that was my ally. That was someone that was in my court. So in certain things that, took place, I didn't really feel that family was the support system. I was told, make sure you don't get pregnant, make sure you have a good job, make sure these were the warnings that I got as a little girl. So I couldn't run to anyone as an adult and say, I messed up, I need help. So I walked into a drop-in center and I said, hey, I need a job, I need a volunteer position, I'll start anywhere. And I started in harm reduction. And I worked with a group of people who, on days where I didn't have anything to eat, would sneak me an extra lunch, would pack me a food bank bag. That was my family. So on holidays now, I don't go to my grandma's house. I go to the drop-in and I put on my hairnet and my gloves and I serve food with people. And I remember the people that held me and took care of me when I felt like there was nothing, especially after I lost my dad. And it was those same drop-in staff that when I started to work with them, I became the lead harm reduction worker in that organization. And I called my son's worker, the last worker that I ever remembered my son having. And I said, hi, can you come see me at work? And I told my team to suit up. I told everyone, wear your best, even though it's a drop-in center. And I said, wear your best, there's a worker coming. And reception buzzed her in and she came into my office and she said, Cassandra, I'm gonna be real with you. this isn't what I expected to see. Like, this is amazing, but this is what's happening with your sons. And this was about 8 years later, so I had to get an update. I had to find out that they've been separated, living separately, not visiting each other. Some changed foster homes because the foster parents couldn't handle them. They were too angry. They were too aggressive. They asked questions. And one of their foster parents actually said, your mom drank and smoked and did drugs when she was pregnant with you, and that's why you are the way you are. So when he was able to email me, he actually asked me, why did you do these things that, you know, resulted in me being this way? And I didn't know how to answer him. And I said, I'm sorry someone told you about our life and that I wasn't the one that could tell you our story, but I'm open to telling you what happened. But the morning of November 17th, 2017, I packed my bag and I met my first son. After 10 years, I walked into a Mandarin restaurant and he was sitting there, and I had lunch with him and I followed him as he ate the buffet food and watched how he walked and watched how he grew up and looked like me and looked like his dad. And I just felt proud. And by January, I was in family court. A judge was congratulating me because it was the first time they ever processed paperwork where they were giving access back to a parent after so many years. He said, congratulations. And I said, thanks, but congratulations for what? Because the son that was taken from me in the hospital in 2009 never ever got to know me. I never remembered, you know, the last time that I had with him because I was locked in a hospital room so that he could be apprehended and taken away by a worker. So the work that I do today is representative of someone that I would have wanted to have in my life when I was going through everything. When I sit down in house checks, when workers come in with their clipboards and call parents addicts because they've overdosed in the hospital or been released from a shelter and a worker disclosed that they use, I say, please do not use that language, because that goes in court paperwork. That's just consistent in how people are stigmatized and discriminated against based on one person's misconception or opinion of them. And if I didn't have someone in my life to do that, I want to be that person for anyone that I can now. Because work in harm reduction itself saved my life. That's why I'll continue to dedicate my life to the work that I'm doing in this, because at the end of the day, there's nothing else that I felt called to do. Harm reduction gave me my second chance. And harm reduction, my colleagues in harm reduction were the ones that congratulated me when I got access to my son. And I'll continue to do this work for as long as I can. Thank you for having me here, and I'm looking forward to your questions. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much. We're going to open up for questions. I'm sure you have lots. I've already cataloged a bunch of them. So I'll probably start off with them. But I did want to say that there's a, well, let's just start off with some of these questions and that we have here. One of the questions that's come up, and hopefully our panelists will be able to speak to this. How can we work harm reduction into childcare services? Parents should not be in fear of losing their children for self-medicating if use is not problematic, or, you know, let's shift that around and say it might not be self-medicating. It's, you know, a person using a substance. Do any of the panelists would like to respond to that question?
I can. So I think to even introduce that conversation to folks like me, we have to look at the fact that there hasn't been an ability for us, or even just a dialogue available for us to disclose safely that we've used without that our children being apprehended as a consequence, or other assumptions being made about use. And like I said, when I disclosed that I used marijuana, they were like, oh, are you sure you don't do coke sometimes? Because, you know, women your age do that. And you sure you don't this sometimes? And I said, I told you what I use. But there was always that digging and need to find out more. So while it's great to think that, you know, different child protection services should have this as an option, they also need to do the work with the communities that they've harmed with their previous interactions. I think that I don't believe, people of color are going to believe that it's a safe dialogue for them to even disclose. They'll deny it. They'll lie. They'll drink Ceresit tea to clean out their system, to try and make sure their blood test is light. Like, I've seen people try to do different things, even in the sense that they've even disclosed to their worker before. But again, there's that digging for more. So I think a lot of work needs to be done in terms of repairing, and also with the workers itself, like checking their own biases that they also convey in their interactions with folks, because again, dialogues aren't going to be like even happening comfortably in settings where someone knows that they're already being judged.
Vida, Kayla, do you want to respond to that question? Or to anything that was mentioned by Cassandra?
Can you repeat the question? My computer kicked me out for a minute and I had to log back on.
Sure. It was just, how can harm reduction work into childcare services so that parents don't fear losing their children if they're self-medicating or using drugs where they feel it's not problematic?
I think I caught at the end of what Cassandra said, sorry, but I think so much of it, like she said, has to do with assumptions. And as professionals and as people who are support workers, we really have to check our assumptions and our approach when we're talking to people, and understand and recognize that not all substance use is problematic, that there's reasons why people do the things that we do, and we have to consider that as well. And that we have to separate our own biases and our own values and, moral judgments apart from the work that we do. And our first priority always should be to create a safe space and a safe place. And that should be the primary goal before meeting any outcomes or meeting any deadlines or achieving anything, and really recognize what success looks like. When I talk to people and when I train staff, I talk about success really means that people come back. If somebody comes back to you, you've been successful in your job. That should be your only gauge in your approach to work, is that if you can create a place where people come back to you, then you are successful. Success doesn't mean getting somebody into treatment or getting somebody to do something or getting somebody, then we move into places where we're manipulating the people accessing services to meet our own personal needs, and that's not healthy. And I see that a lot in professionals and in different organizations, and especially those, like I said, I don't know about other places, but here in Saskatchewan we hear a lot of people talking about doing harm reduction work, but what they're actually doing is just trying to make themselves feel better about their jobs and think that they're doing a good job, because they're forcing people and manipulating people into, meeting these outcomes that, aren't actually healthy for the person.
Just to build a bit on what folks have already said, I want to challenge the idea of reform a little bit. The idea that these services can be improved. Cassandra kind of touched on it, and that's that for some people, the interactions with those systems have been so incredibly harmful that there's actually no way to reform those systems. Like, we need to burn it down, and then we need like folks like Cassandra and Kayla to like build us new systems, because I don't think we can fix this. I think it's one of those systems that has just caused too much harm to continue.
Vida, that really speaks to the next question that we had, which was, how do you provide support for parents and children and advocacy for and with them while you're dealing with violence, state violence that criminalizes, punishes, blames, disenfranchises, discriminates against these people. And so all of you are juggling that in your work. So I'd really be, if you could respond to that question a bit more.
I can talk to that a little bit from what we do. It's not easy. It is, and I think, anybody that works for a harm reduction agency recognizes how difficult it is to navigate systems that were created to make people fail. And, you know, it's not easy working with children and families in a way that is different and so opposing to the system that we're trying to navigate. What I tell people all the time is, as an advocate, in order to successfully advocate through that system, it is so important that you understand the system that you're going into. Because if you go in just really angry and ready to fight and don't understand the laws and the procedures and the policies that they're throwing at you, and understand, you know, how the court system works and how all of that, you're not going to find a lot of success. But I find a lot of success from arguing their own laws against them and challenging workers to look at, does this actually fit in the law, or is this an assumption that you're making about this situation? And what falls within you know, their policies, their procedures. We, you know, our staff read the policy manuals, they read the law, our Child and Family Act. We have the training manuals that the workers have. I have copies of we use structured decision making in our child protection system here. And I have all of those flow charts. I know what all those boxes are that need to be ticked. And all the staff have to be really aware of those things, so that when we're going to fight with all of the knowledge that they have. And then we can really play into all of those things and show all the places where they're not following the law, or where it doesn't fit, or why this doesn't work.
Hi, Susan, can you repeat the question, please?
You're on mute, Susan.
Yeah, broadly, it was just how can we provide support and work with parents and advocate with them when they're or are currently using substances, while they're still dealing with ongoing state violence that discriminates against them, that punishes them, blames them. And so just how do you juggle that in your own work, in your own life, that the services that groups and individuals provide is against the backdrop of this ongoing state violence?
I can speak a little bit to that. I have limited experience in that area, but I find supporting individuals is not the difficult part. You know, normal harm reduction stuff, meeting people where they're at, like working on whatever they want you to work on is all easy. It's fun. It's so fun to get to work with people and on accomplishing whatever their goals are. The tricky part is when you, as the service provider or helper, are butting heads with this system and trying to advocate for that person. And I got some good advice quite a few years ago from one of my mentors in Winnipeg, Margaret Bryant, and she used the principle of just being as nice as possible. You know, people are mad. The person you're working with is mad, and they should be mad. They're getting messed up by the system. But when I call them, what I can do as the worker and with the privileges I hold is win them over and make them love me so that they'll do what I want. That's been kind of my main method that I've tried.
I think what I've done I think I've had to kind of support folks in different ways, because people are in different stages of comfort in accessing any type of support, even telling someone what their issues are. And especially when you're dealing with the ACB community, there's a lot of shame around child protection, even having your children apprehended, or even having the system called on you. That's like oh, get your kids back, or you don't have your kids. It's always something like some type of insult, right? So if you're an ACB person going into an ACB family and saying, look, this is a service that I'm providing, like I'm here to support you, you have to convince them that you're actually going to help them. Because there's so many faces and so many, you know, people that they encounter that say, yeah, I'm here to help, and they write on a clipboard, and then that here to help turns into another knock on the door with another service saying you got flagged or we got a call about this, and it leads to something else that leads to something else. Establishing a relationship of trust with this community is so important. Racialized people do not feel comfortable accessing any kind of support. They'd rather do it themselves because trust has been broken. Right? So when I'm thinking of even my own experiences sitting in the CAS office, Toronto Children's Aid Society, let me just call them. That's the office I was sitting in. I've spoken for them as well. So I just want to put that out there. I feel pretty open about my involvement with advocating for the community as it relates to workers calling them into the office, having visits with their children, preparing for kinship. And I'm usually there as a community support. I let them know that I'm someone with lived experience. I'm not a family member, but I'm a community member. And I believe this service or this is available for other communities. So I would like to offer this support for them. And I usually get the, oh, this is impressive. Can I get more information from you about who you are and what your name is? And I give them my business card. And I let them know that I'm here to support the family. And when I hear language like, oh, you're addicted, you're like labels, I ask them to correct themselves. I stop the dialogue, ask them to correct themselves. I let the parent know that they have the right to even ask for a letter of support if their housing's in danger. There are little things that people do not know. And again, these are filling in the gaps that I fell through. So my housing was in jeopardy. I didn't know that one of the requirements, if the CIS said, look, we have this issue with your housing, you might get your children taken away if this isn't dealt with, that they're supposed to produce a letter. There's actually a box, a check mark that they could put in a housing application and supply that letter. You know how many meetings I've had to be in and telling families, and then the worker saying, oh, let me check in with my supervisor, said, you know that that's available and you know that that's something you could provide. So stop playing around. Sometimes that's how you have to be. So I get the nice, and I get what Vita's saying about being nice, but the niceness isn't there if they're not being nice to the families. If they're not respecting the family, if they're playing fool to catch wise or whatever the case may be, I call it out because that's what wasted my time for 8-9 years. That's what had me wandering and not knowing what was available for me because someone wasn't in the room saying, come on, and let's move forward. So what do they need from the family, the kinship family? This is what's prepared. Okay. And when are we doing the visit? Like sometimes you have to pull the reins and be that strong person for that individual because they're weak. They feel defeated by the system. It's like someone coming out of prison. They feel like, yeah, they're free, but they still feel like they're chained. So when you know that knock can be on the door at any time, that you have an open case, so they can come in, look in your fridge, look in your cupboard. Sometimes it's do you need me to pick up a food bank emergency, get some gift cards for you so you can get food? That's what support looks like too. So support is so broad because you don't know where that person's at in terms of their progress with, even getting their children back, even if the reunification is even something that's possible for them. So looking at their basic needs is important. Sometimes being a voice is important. Sometimes letting them know, look, you can ask for this, you can ask for that. Do you need me to email that to you? Do you want me to write that down? That's what support is for me.
Thank you, Cassandra. And it really speaks to when I was going through the Mother Risk files, and for those of you who might not know what Mother Risk was, it was a lab in Toronto that Child Protection and social workers sent urine samples to be tested for drug use, but other provinces did as well. But it was found that those tests were inaccurate. The findings of the tests were inaccurate, but in fact, children had been apprehended, adopted, and for the majority of parents, there is no family reconciliation that happened at all. But in those files, it was quite revealing that very rarely did even the word harm reduction come up. It was like absent. And even in their final reports, they didn't really speak to harm reduction in any way. And so you were speaking about what you can provide for people as they're navigating these violent systems. And one of the questions was asking further, how can I encourage case or social workers to accept and recognize harm reduction models and not push for unrealistic abstinent models or unrealistic programs, keeping parents busy when there may not be any reconciliation, bringing the children home, even after completion of those programs and those hoops that we make people hop. So if you could just continue expanding on how to work with caseworkers and social workers to accept a harm reduction model.
If social workers and caseworkers can't accept a harm reduction model, they should not be in that role or have that power. That's it.
What we see so often with our child protection office is that they're often people coming out of school that are brand new, have never worked anywhere else, and that the training that they're provided is completely insufficient. I'm not a social worker, and I don't want to offend any social workers, but really what social work school teaches people is a lot of theory and a lot of, overarching ideas about practice, but they don't actually teach you how to work with people. And then, so they come out of school, go into this job where they have, are built up with a lot of power and control over other people's lives, and they aren't given sufficient training. And that's something that I've been advocating at a provincial level for, is that workers need better training on how to actually deal with people. And a child protection worker should know where to send somebody for help. So if you're entering into somebody's life and they need help with housing, you should be able to tell them where to get that help. You should be able to tell them how to access the supports that you're requiring them to access, but so many workers don't. They don't take the time to familiarize themselves with what's happening in their communities, and they don't understand what life is. They seem so far removed from the realities of life and come from this complete viewpoint of privilege that they don't understand what it means to use substances and what the true impact is, or they don't ask, is your substance use problematic? That question's never asked. The minute substances are associated with a call or an intervention, those parents are immediately labeled an addict and they need to go to treatment. That doesn't apply to everybody, but they don't take the time to learn those things. And I really, like Vita was saying, the system's so broken innately. But workers really need to take the responsibility to learn and educate themselves. And the workers that I've had the best success with and the best relationships with over the last 15 years are the workers who have done that. And we've had workers that have come to our building and learned more and taken the time to ask questions and see the value in what we're doing. And those are the workers that I don't get angry with when I have to go meet with, because I know they're listening to what we have to say and looking at things a little bit differently. But for most workers here, that's not the case. They're so uneducated and so disconnected from the realities of what it actually means for so many of these families, and don't acknowledge the trauma that they're causing by their interventions and the way that they're doing things. And one of the things I hate the most, and I get so angry, is when I'm sitting in a case conference and kids have just been taken and a worker looks at a parent and says, "Oh, don't yell at me. You don't have the right to do that." Or, "Why are you crying? Stop crying. Oh, you're being too emotional." How ignorant is that to say to somebody whose children you just took, right? And there's just such a disconnect there. And I really believe system reform is the foundation of that, but workers need to be required to be more educated and more aware of what is happening.
Yeah, I agree with everything Kayla said, so I don't want to repeat what she said, but just to add to what she said at the end, if systems and policies actually need to be implemented by management, and I'm not thinking that workers have the ability to create like harm reduction trainings or access those trainings unless it's something required through their orientation process. I think that that should be mandatory. The same way I'm going into different service providers, training security guards in harm reduction, you're dealing with caseworkers that have families who are using substances that are not trained in harm reduction, but I'm training security guards, like they should be accessing that same support as well. And I would hope that that would result in change, but sometimes the individual actually enjoys the fact that their job gives them the ability to do what they do. And I'm being completely honest. This isn't, we're gonna change the world and kumbaya and hold hands when the training's over. Some already come in with their bias. I spoke at the AGM for Toronto Children's Aid Society, and one of my former workers was in the audience. And I remember finishing my speech, walking to the lobby, saying goodbye, giving them my stuff. And she walked up to me and said, I remember you, I remember you. And she had tears running down her face. I'm like, what? She goes, I remember your sons, your beautiful boys. And she's like, I'm so sorry. She goes, I was hard on you and I shouldn't have been. This was a woman of color. And I could have taken that moment and given her a hug back and felt really good. But I actually remember feeling the anxiety of her, knowing when she's coming to the house, remembering how she treated me when my son was in his high chair and flipped his cereal over and said, your house is a mess. I remember feeling like she wasn't giving me a chance. So that hug and that tear that she dropped on my shoulder didn't mean anything. We're coming into a system with workers that actually really don't care about the individual and love the job that they have. So, you know, trainings are great and, you know, we can change the world with information, but let's make things mandatory and actually have consequences for people who violate families' basic rights. I believe that her acknowledging that she didn't give me a fighting chance and that she's still doing that work is a problem, because I don't know how many other families are opening their door to her face and her looking around the house to see one spilled bowl of cereal and saying, you know, after this visit, the house was a mess. So, you know, yeah, implementing these policies and all of that's great. You need to work on the individuals, make sure you're hiring people who are parents, hiring people with lived experience. Why doesn't child protection have people who have had their children apprehended working for them? Of all the years that they've been kicking down the doors in people's families, they haven't found other people like me. Oh, Cassandra, let's do some consulting work. I would never be a worker, but you need to have people working there that have had experience with them, because there's no understanding. Sometimes these workers are fresh out of school and this is a job that they have and they're coming and telling me how to be a mother. How dare you? No. So I just, you know, and this is me saying, yes, change is going to happen, but it might happen through programs like mine or me starting my own. Well, this is what I want to do, is start my own not-for-profit that actually advocates for families. We go to visits, we pick up the moms when they have to send their children to the offices or when their children are apprehended. We're taking them, even if it's an overnight visit or something that we're doing, we're taking them to a hotel or taking them somewhere so we can make sure they're okay, that they have a meal, that they're not feeling like this is the last day of their life. There's nothing there. And I don't think we should look to the system for the system to change. We need to build our own systems to enforce those changes. I've been sitting here watching, you know, the child protection system fail my community for years. I'm not looking for them to do anything different than what they're doing, because this is what they know. We have to show them that we know different and that we're ready to kick down the doors.
Anybody else want to add before I go to the next question? Okay, I think this links though to the conversation that we've been having. The question was in relation to how might we engage First Nations communities, Black communities, to address any type of uptick in drug use, especially hard drug use, I guess we would say. And so I'll leave that for you to respond to. You know, are there alternative ways, I guess, to work with what are the issues that would be most important? All of you and Cassandra, as the last speaker, you know, spoke about cultural differences and experiences, in your case, Cassandra, in the Black community, how the issues are never addressed. white supremacy, ongoing colonialism. You know, it didn't end last week, and it doesn't look like it's ending anytime soon. So we know that there's problems in relation to the terminology that we even use, this idea of substance abuse, addiction, all of these words that really erase what the experience might be for the person. So in relation to First Nations community, maybe we'll start there. How might harm reduction workers and drug user unions and advocates work with First Nations communities as allies to address any type of harms related to drugs?
I can go first, and I'm just gonna amplify something someone else has told me. We have a local knowledge keeper here who I've had the extreme pleasure of being in a lot of harm reduction meetings with, named Leslie Spillett. And at one of my first meetings with her, I was like 20, just a baby harm reductionist. She said, "I don't want to talk about this anymore. I want to talk about well communities." And we got into that further, and to paraphrase her wisdom and genius, it was just that to work with her community, she was saying that harm reduction needs to be more holistic, and manage to focus on well communities. And we've seen research to support this too in some places, that by building and supporting well communities, problematic substance use and harms associated with substance use decrease. So that's the only thing I'll speak.
And I suppose too, maybe that could be added to this, you know, the long history of medicinal plants that continue today, and the idea that use of drugs is not necessarily negative or positive. People use for very diverse reasons. One of the biggest reasons people use substances is for pleasure. And we have huge difficulty in accepting that idea, except for, you know, legal drugs like alcohol, where you're allowed to go home and have your wine unless you're under the focus of child protection. So I wonder if there's another question that was logged was, do you think that there's different issues that parents are facing in relation to rural or suburban or urban centers? Do we see differences in how child protection and child apprehension and services work in these different locations? And I think we could add, you know, on reserves as well.
Yeah, I definitely think that there's some type of targeted approach to child protection in certain spaces. And a lot of, again, preconceived notions, like if a worker is going into a Toronto community housing building, let's say, or any type of subsidized housing, community housing, I think assumptions are going to be made about the education, the income level of the family, and they're going to be automatically undermined. But if they're walking into like the Bridle Path area of Toronto and going through a gated, you know, entrance, they're already impressed. They're already putting themselves, like putting that family on a pedestal regardless of what they encounter. And we've actually seen that. We've seen problems with parents just wanting to have interactions with the workers in a better setting. They're like, hey, I actually want to like rent an Airbnb and have them come here because I know they're going to treat me differently because of where I live. But I think I interrupted Kayla because she was about to answer this. No? Okay. Yeah, like I think that that's definitely reflective in the approach. I also feel that if there's previous history with the family, because again, like with my eldest son, I had encounters with them at the beginning, and then they left for a while and came back. Because we had any type of open file before, I think that, again, you're not given that chance. There's very much a targeted approach depending on like where you're located and what your history is with them as well. And I think that has a lot to do with location too.
Yes. Yes.
We see huge variances in child protection in our province, like from urban to rural, from city to city, on reserve, off reserve. It is so dependent on who is in that community working as to how things look. And we have one community here specifically that has the highest rates of child apprehension in the province. And the burnout rates of workers, child protection workers, there are so great, they can't actually employ people there. Like they ship people from all over the province to go work there temporarily because they have, the case files are so big, and it's been like this for years. And they've never stopped to say, well, why is this? Or what should we be doing differently that this isn't working? But it just continues to perpetuate it. Our First Nations community here has fought for years to get autonomy over their child protection offices. And that was just granted within the last couple years. And so there's still huge issues between child protection cases on reserve versus urban centers. If you're Indigenous and live in an urban center, how do you access your tribal council support effectively? We try and fight a lot to get cases moved to on reserve workers if that's where the children have been placed. There's no consistency. And there really is, like when you look at communities that we have that are notoriously more racist and more discriminatory in reputation, you see the impact that that has on child apprehension levels. And, you know, like Cassandra was saying, this targeted approach in some communities, almost like a vengeance towards Indigenous people here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and there was just a report from Jurastat, which looks at criminal offenses in smaller First Nations communities across Canada. And we can, you know, everybody knows because of the prison stats that Indigenous and Black people make up the majority of people in prison. And that has to do with criminalization, not that the people are more criminal. But this recent report supported that. They saw that across Canada, that Indigenous people in smaller communities are, you know, 10 times higher rates of drug offenses and other offenses. And so, you know, our drug laws have always been race-based, to be quite clear, and that continues today. And I think that goes hand in hand, as you've been saying, with child protection services as well. And, you know, there was just a recent BC report looking at racism in our healthcare system, especially for people who are using substances. So we've heard this over and over and over and over again. It's not new news. I suppose the question that questions people have been asking is like, how do we make this shift to, you know, okay, we've known about it for a long time, but now we want to change what's going on. And one of the questions around change that was asked by our participants was, how do you address male violence, especially in relation to male violence against women who have had or continue to use substances, especially in the way they exploit they use child protection and family court systems to punish mothers and to gain custody from them. Anybody want to take that on?
So I've been supporting a mom in my job for the last 10 years who is dealing with exactly that situation. And we have cycled through that so many times. She is an active substance user. Her ex-partner uses alcohol. And so there was a lot of bias initially around that when child protection became involved. He was extremely violent towards her, extremely violent, but she was constantly being punished because she was using substances. And, you know, if he would attack her, she would then go and use substances for a long periods of time to deal with the trauma. And we saw she was in treatment once, and while she was in treatment, child protection gave full custody to the dad, closed the file without telling her, and had her help the dad remove her from the lease, the bills, and the income assistance file. So she exited treatment with no money, no home, no nothing, and nobody told her. And we see this all the time. And then he, you know, would spiral. And what we heard from the workers over and over and over again was, well, he's violent to her, but he's still a good dad. But then why aren't we hearing she's using substances because of the violence, but she's still a good mom? And we're now, after doing this cycle for so many years, are now in private family court trying to get her better access to those kids. And it's absolutely sickening, absolutely sickening. We work with a lot of families dealing with intimate partner violence, and a lot of the families that we work with are not wanting to separate, and they want to stay together. And that, you know, is a different way to work through things. But for so many people who have dads that show up after those situations and say, I'll take the kids, they get them. And then the file's closed because they're placed with a parent. And then we're in family court for months and months and months trying to prove that this mom should have access to those kids.
Cassandra, Vida, do you have anything you'd like to add to that issue?
I'm just going back to something I said earlier, which is that drug use should never be a reason to not have access to your children, just never. If there's other issues, you know, abuse or cupboards are bared, like deal with those issues, but just using drugs should not be a reason to apprehend someone's kids ever. So if that was not a reason someone could use to apprehend kids, then people wouldn't be able to use it as a weapon in that way.
And I just wanted to add that in a lot of cases, the fathers actually know that they could use the system to hurt the mother. And they'll do a lot more like invasive, intrusive things with the mom, like going into different history and visiting with her. And if they're not living in the same space, they're not even visiting the father's house. But then, you know, when court days come and the dad's like, I want my kids, and they can petition to do that, the same processes don't take place for the dad. Like, I think the mothers get the, you know, the harder end of the treatments in that sense. And fathers definitely know how to use the system against them, unfortunately. I think I've seen that a lot too in cases where both parents are using, and then the father makes the call and says this mother's using, but discloses nothing about his use. And then just through the way things work, he'll get temporary custody of the children while they're, you know, doing everything with the mom. So yeah, just to add to what Kayla and Vida said.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, really, the whole construct of the Family Law Act and our child protection policies as well work hand in hand, but there's quite a bit of writing and people's testimonies about sort of male coercive control through family court systems, you know, and how it puts women and the other parent on the defensive and never being able to catch up because the burden then is on her. So thank you for responding to that question. Another question that a person has is, what can parents do about non-consensual or coercive drug testing of parents and newborns? In your experience, what might they do to limit that happening?
As far as I know, they can't do anything unless they avoid getting the test done, which is what I did for a couple of months because I felt the worker, again, was making assumptions, and I already told her that I smoked. She's like, well, cut your hair. I don't care if it's weave. You'll have to take it off and we'll cut it. And I'm like, okay. And I just avoided it, the avoidance. But I also gave birth to a child and he was apprehended from the hospital and they automatically tested him. Right. So I couldn't tell them not to. So I don't think that there was even the option of it being consensual or non-consensual. Like when it comes to the children, they do it. And then when it comes to you, you pretty much avoid it until you have to do it, which is what I did.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And if people aren't aware, you know, we do urine testing and hair testing. They're two different procedures, but in the hair, remnants of the drug lasts much longer than in urine testing.
Something we see here a lot with women going into hospital when they're having baby, and people who are delivering babies, drug testing is not a standard procedure in hospitals when you go in to deliver a baby. But the population that I support are more likely to be drug tested on admission, and it's treated like it's a standard procedure. Like they just have to do it because, you know, when I went in to have my kids, I wasn't drug tested. And it's this double standard and just like that further racialization and discrimination that women who are Indigenous that go into our hospital system to have babies, especially if they present like they, you know, maybe are homeless or are, you know, poor, all of those things are more likely to be drug tested as part of their like intake procedure, and they don't even know. And that like so much of it comes down to people not being informed. There's so little informed consent in our healthcare system a lot of the times, especially around marginalized people and people of color, where they're, you know, people aren't told all the facts or given all their rights and explained things are just done to them. And really the only way out of that is for our healthcare system to inform them of their rights and have conversations and do those things, and that people are aware of what their rights are around testing. As far as when child protection's involved, you know, same as Cassandra, like I don't think there's a way around it other than, you know, parents just don't go in and they're punished.
Anything else? Any of the panelists would like to add to that question? All right, well, we have another question, and that is, how can drug users, organizations, or groups that are working with people with expertise in drug use fight for the rights of people who use drugs and whose children have been stolen from them? So I suppose they're asking, you know, is there anything else that they can do in their advocacy, in their drug user unions and their harm reduction groups and whatever type of group that they're working with, to protect the rights of people who use substances in relation to child apprehension by the state?
I don't really know how to answer that because here in Saskatchewan, we don't have a really strong presence of drug user groups. It's something we're very much lacking in our province. We're now just, you know, starting to get the coordination of peers in HIV programming, right? So Saskatchewan just tends to be about a decade behind everybody else all the time with those things. But I think it's so important trying to involve people who have that experience, who have had experiences with the child protection system, to work in that system and change that system is so important.
Yeah.
I think hiring standards for organizations really need to be looked at. And I think it was Cassandra that was saying, you know, people with living experience should be involved and they should be hired and they should be able to work in those systems and help bring their voices to those systems. And we just don't see that in a lot of those things, where, you know, those experiences are judged for a lifetime in a lot of places, and you're punished for a lifetime for having those involvements.
I'm looking at the time, and I did want to say, I want to ask each of the panelists if there's anything else that they would like to contribute to this session before we sign off. But before we get there, I did want to let you know that there's an anonymous for multiple choice question poll that the participants can fill out. I think you have to go into the question and answer for that. Yeah, there it is. Where do you live? Some other questions as well. If you would take the time to answer that poll, it just gives a better idea of who's participating in the sessions and your questions. And that there's upcoming events that you might be interested in seeing, and to let people know too when they weren't able to attend a session, that within about a week, it'll be on the stimulus website. But there's an upcoming event on December 8th when harm reduction loses its authenticity. That's really interesting. January 20th, the original harm reductionists, people who sell drugs. And February 23rd, harm reduction in prisons. And March 24th, recovery webinar. So I hope some of you can join those webinars in the future. But if we could go back to our panelists, and I'm checking the questions as well. I'd just like to hear from all three of you in relation to anything else that you would like to contribute to this conversation that we're having.
I just wanted to add that even in my role in harm reduction, hiring and recruiting people, I think it's important to highlight that people with lived experience also need to reflect the communities they work in. There needs to be a lot more diversity in harm reduction. And I think that that's the biggest challenge that I have in the work right now, where I feel like I'm kind of the only one doing certain things, but it's also because my community isn't comfortable talking about these challenges, right? So I think this is very much the beginning of this work being done. I'm hopeful that if I share my email in the chat, there's other people that I can connect with that are doing this work as well. It's really very much something that I'm trying to implement as a change in how the world treats Black people, right? Black mothers, that we have a chance. We want to believe that we have a chance of raising our children and being mothers and enjoying that part of our life, even if we use substances. And we want to know what options are available to us if we do. And if we have some type of encounter with child protection or child welfare, that we actually have a chance to get our children back. Like, and I know that that's a big ask and a big wish, but I believe that the more work that I do that's intentional, and the more people I collaborate with that have that same passion, and looking at the fact that we need to hire people that reflect the communities that we work in if we want our work to be intentional and if we want that change to happen. Yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing the future of this, and possibly coming back to the next Stimulus Connect and telling you about more work that I'm doing. So I just wanted to end with saying that, and thank you for having me here.
Oh, thank you, Cassandra. Really sharing your expertise with us.
You know, I just want to say thank you to everybody. This has been an amazing experience, and so wonderful to hear voices from all over the country talking about the work that is being done. One thing I'd like people to think about is, as you're creating programs and services to support people, make sure that you're creating them in a way that is safe for people to access, and that they're actually accessible, and that we, you know, take the focus off of, you know, checking boxes and hitting for certain outcomes, and really look at how to create programs that make people want to come to us and make them want to stay and support, rather than trying to bring people in and make them fit in all of these boxes just so that we can reach our outcomes and do all of that stuff. Because that's, you know, what we see a lot here, is that so many people can't access services because they don't fit the right boxes. And really, our program should be designed to adapt to the people that we serve, not the other way around. This has been an amazing experience. And again, if anybody has any follow-up questions or anything, they're more than welcome to contact me.
Okay. Ida?
Sure. I don't have any inspirational last words, but I just want to say if anyone is in a position where you are thinking about reporting someone, because a lot of folks who work in harm reduction might be in this position at some point where the thought crosses their mind, will I have, should I, do I call one of us and we can check in with you, because I know it can be a lot to carry that yourself. And sometimes someone mentioned in our pre-meeting, people make that call because they're trying to pass off that responsibility. They're like, I'm a burnt out frontline worker. I can't deal with this. I will call it in and then my plate is clean. But don't do that. Call one of us, call another local support that you can talk to and work through that with someone, because I'm hoping that, if even just the people on this call don't report another woman or person that's using drugs to the system, like that's an intervention and that's a change that could result from this that is helpful to the world. That's all.
Thanks, Vida. We have a little bit of time, and so there's two other questions that came in, and I think we'll address them because we started this conclusion a little earlier. But one person wrote that they're a guy who has not gone through the birth process, but he would really like to help initiate change. And so I wonder, do any of the panelists have any idea how a man might help to initiate change in relation to the experience of parents having children and state apprehension? Any words of wisdom?
I think a good place to kind of fall back on for that question is just like principles of solidarity and being an accomplice to people. There's good writings on the internet. I certainly couldn't speak to them now, but the principles of solidarity and being an accomplice to people who are in that position could serve you there.
Anybody else want to respond?
I'm not too sure. I'm thinking of different ways, right? It could be connecting with an outreach group or a group that's doing advocacy work, joining a steering committee. And steering committees do a lot in terms of implementing change or even focusing on certain areas and advocating for that. So if you're someone that's working in community already, like building relationships with people within your community, and if they say, look, I have a worker coming tomorrow and I'm stressed, like ask them, do you want to take a trip to the grocery store? Like, do you have what you need? Do you feel comfortable? Do you need me to be there? Like sometimes people just need a person, just someone that says that they care, someone that shows up, that doesn't, that they're not going to court alone, or they're not facing a visit alone or going home from a visit alone. Because again, depending on where the person's at in terms of being open to receiving support, I know that people get tired of telling their story over and over to people that they can't trust. So even just establishing a relationship with folks that you're already supporting and being that ally, again, like knowing what real solidarity looks like. Again, just being someone that cares is important, and being that one person, you could change someone's life by just caring about them.
Thank you. Sorry, Kayla, go ahead.
Sorry. Over the years, I've worked with some incredible men in this field who have been incredible supports, specifically to women going through this system. And I think one of the things that's constant with all of them is they really recognized the impact that them being male has on the situation, right? And recognizing that themselves, because of their gender, could be a trigger. And that they have to work even harder to make sure that people feel safe, because innately they are seen as more threatening or harder to work with. And I've seen some incredible men over the years do fantastic things in this field.
Okay, so another question was, can any of the panelists speak to how queer and trans parents are also impacted? And I agree, it's easy for them to be made invisible in some conversations. And if any of the panelists have experience working with queer and gender diverse parents, and how they might be impacted by the war on drugs and the child welfare systems.
Yeah, and thank you for that question about the queer and trans community, because at Black Cap, that's what we see a lot of. Like where I'm working, we actually have a lot of newcomers and people coming into the country and fleeing their countries that persecuted and discriminated against them for their sexual identity, and then being open about their relationships. They actually deal with a culture shock when they come here. Coming here to a community that's open with same gender loving couples and just feeling very free in that, but then at the same time, processes like child protection that they're not used to in their countries come into their life. So again, it is part of that culture shock. And we are finding that a lot of queer and trans families pretend not to be in relationship with each other in certain cases, so that they don't feel that the worker or whoever is there is discriminating against them or making any prejudgments. And that's based on their experiences back home. Right. So they tend to come to us and say, you know, I didn't want to do what the worker said because I didn't know what was going to happen. And I ended up in court and this is what it was. Sometimes a language barrier is present. Right. And this is what we're seeing in the organization that I work with, because we're an all Black organization. Right. So what we're having is, again, a lot of people coming from different countries that don't know what's in store for them here in Canada. They're like, yeah, this is a great opportunity. Canada's the land of whatever, but escaping the persecution that they're feeling they've faced in their countries for being queer or being trans, and they're coming here and feeling very free in their sexual identity, but then not understanding how to navigate through the system, or even how to approach, like, someone comes to my door and can take my kids. Again, this is something that's very new culturally to some folks, right? So again, and then overlapping that with them feeling the culture shock of being here and being able to be open with their sexual identity, it's very mixed, and it's very difficult to navigate in some cases. And again, it's just a matter of some supports that have to be in place, and sometimes physically being there or introducing them to support groups, because some of the families are also living with HIV as well. So there are a lot of overlapping and overarching issues that are contributing to again, the culture shock that they're facing. But we've seen a lot of that conflict when it comes to the queer and trans community.
The peer advisory councils or advisory councils of people who use drugs that I get to collaborate with have a lot of trans and queer folks represented. And one thing I've heard from them is that a lot of the treatment programs and harm reduction programs, or even helpful supportive parenting programs or things like that, are gendered. So they're not able to access that help in the same way. And that's an important thing to think in mind too when we're talking about program planning, is the ways that language or the way we frame programs can exclude some people.
Kayla, did you have anything you wanted to contribute?
We don't see a huge number of queer and trans parents accessing supports through us. It's definitely a community here that doesn't get the attention that it needs, especially around parenting and child protection issues. What I have seen over the years is, like Cassandra was saying, not wanting to admit who your partner is or not disclosing that information. And where we've seen the most issues is if there is intimate partner violence in that relationship, especially if it is two people that identify as female, that violence isn't taken seriously the same way. Like, it's not real, or it's not the same. And kind of dismissing that it is, you know, it creates the same traumas, the same impact on that family, but accessing supports for those things are so much more difficult. And especially when we have gendered-based support programs around intimate partner violence, where, you know, it's often like, you know, a man goes here and a woman goes here. But if we have, you know, two people that identify as female, well, then they can't go to the same group. Well, if there's only one group, where are they supposed to go, right? So there's, you know, a lot of the support programs that are set up are not set up in a way to support those situations. And that, you know, intimate partner violence in the queer and trans community, I think is something that is so overlooked in so many of the programs that are designed to support it.
Thank you, Kayla. And we have one last question before we sign off and thank everybody and remind you of the link to the evaluation survey. This question was to Cassandra specifically. From your personal experience, what would you say are the 3 top things that harm reduction agencies should offer to individuals who are pregnant, had children using substances in order to have they're saying their buy-in? But you know, I'm assuming they're just the top 3 things that you would say that you could offer individuals. Difficult question. There might not be a top 3, but whatever. Give it your best, Cassandra.
I think that there needs to be some education, and maybe this could be something new that we're introducing in harm reduction programs about giving options to mothers that are breastfeeding that they could pump, and even creating care plans with, or even parents together creating care plans around using and taking care of their children and managing their use with those workers. I think that programs have the capacity to do that with the amazing folks doing harm reduction in this country. So I think that that's a possibility, just something to open up. And again, just support groups are so important. I remember going into a group called Caribbean Mums, and it was within a drop-in center that had a harm reduction program. And there was a harm reduction worker there, and she noticed the first day I came back without my son, and she asked me where he was. And she just knew from the look on my face that he was gone. It was the safe place for me to be, because I returned to that program even after they apprehended my children, and they helped me, you know, with my food bank appointments so that I could have food for my visits and things like that. So I think harm reduction programs can offer different supports as it relates to, again, education around managing use, obviously the access to safe supplies. But again, the support groups are important, and people that aren't going to ask, you know, evasive questions or invasive questions and being judgmental, right? Because all the worker had to do is see the look on my face, the drop-in program worker, to know that my son was gone. So, and I think that was a moment where I could have turned away from the service if I was treated differently. So I think that that's something that harm reduction offers. It's just that understanding and that level of non-judgment that people need at their worst. I hope that answers the question. I'm such a rambler, sorry.
No, thank you so much, Cassandra. I'd like to take this time for all our participants. I hope you've been following the chat, and there's other people have posted other information. There's the resources that Shay has put up as well. I want to thank everyone for coming to this session. I want to thank our amazing panelists, you know, Cassandra, Vida, Kayla, thank you so much. Big hand for coming today and sharing your expertise with us, and, you know, rallying us to go back to our work as well and try to implement better services and to resist the types of everyday violence that parents experience, especially in relation to child apprehension and that lifelong grief and violence that parents, mothers experience. I also want to thank Shay, who does an amazing job in bringing this all together for us, and also has the cap of like making sure that the technology works. Sophie for helping us with the translations, and, you know, Stimulus Connect, Canadian Drug Policy Coalition, all of these 2 groups have been bringing us together, you know, through technology until we can all get together physically. I don't know what else to say except thank you for being here, and, you know, big thanks to the team that I'm not aware of in the background who brought this to us. Much appreciated, and so nice to see everyone and to see the amazing chats and questions.
I set Susan up for failure because it actually says, thanks, Susan, for moderating the event. So let me just say thank you, Susan, for wrangling us cats.
My pleasure. It was lovely to meet everybody.
There's my sense is that this conversation won't end. Certainly, I definitely heard from Cassandra, and I'm sure the others are in on this as well. Is that it makes sense to do more work, but also to do some work related to pulling folks who are BIPOC who are working in harm reduction or affected by harm reduction together, because they have some of the very same issues, and it'd be great to connect. And I would love to help with that if anybody's interested in a little hand. Yeah, we're going to see everybody else on Tuesday if you come back for the next stimulus webinar.
Okay, great.
Thank you, everyone. It was